Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is the Steven now, and yes, we are back in Animation Corner for yet another animated TV show review. Today, we'll be reviewing the Spectacular Spider-Man animated series. Arguably one of the best interpretations of Spider-Man out there, and arguably maybe one of the most unique and very interesting superhero cartoons out there. And of course, without any further ado, let's get into a bit of background about the show. Now, Spectacular Spider-Man is based off the superhero character Spider-Man, which was published in Marvel Comics, and the TV show was developed by Greg Weisman and Victor Cook. In terms of overall tone and style, the series was based on primarily the Stan Lee and Steve Ditko era of Spider-Man. And this ain't the first time Spider-Man had a cartoon show. There was one in the late 60s. There was the 90s Spider-Man animated show. And essentially, this show was a love letter to essentially Spider-Man, the 60s, version of Spider-Man when he was still in high school. The show essentially balances these aspects of Spider-Man's, elements of Spider-Man that is always there: action, drama, and comedy, and this is all tied into the high school setting. Again, Spider-Man was a unique superhero in his time because most teenage superheroes were given the role of being a sidekick. But this was the first time a teenage superhero really had his own his own series, and we get to see him battle crime but also struggle with school life. And that's the thing with Spider-Man that has made it so successful. Because he was a unique superhero around his time. And this version of Spider-Man is definitely one out there as one of the most interesting interpretations. And I agree. This show sadly only ran for 2 seasons. In fact, the first season, I believe, came out on, if I recall correctly, it came out in 2008 and then ended in 2009. The series only ended after 2 seasons despite receiving critical acclaim for story writing and having a very unique visual design. It's again more inspired with like the 60s era, but yet somehow still being more modernized to the pop culture era. You know, like modern era, not pop culture, modern era. Now, sadly, after this season, will we get another Spider-Man TV show, Ultimate Spider-Man? It's okay, but I don't think it was anywhere near this level. The first season originally aired on the CW, but then the second season aired on Disney XD. Now, you see, what happened is, why it only ended after 2 seasons? But here's the thing. When the show was still airing, Spider-Man wasn't owned by Marvel. Well, the creative license was actually owned by Sony. So as a result, when Disney bought Marvel, they bought the rights to the Spider-Man character. And what Sony did, they stopped the show because they only got the property to Spectacular Spider-Man, and resulted them to create the Spider-Man movies, but not the TV show. Which of course led to the Amazing Spider-Man films, and we know how that ended, which essentially resulted in Spider-Man returning back to Marvel. Also, Disney owned the right to make another Spider-Man TV show, which is how we got Ultimate Spider-Man. The fact the show ended and there was huge plans for further seasons and further characters to come out is a real shame. When you watch this show, it's another example of the creative team like really in love with their product and clearly being a fan of Spider-Man as a character and wanting to do their own interpretation to really stand out amongst the crowd. So I really love this show for what it is. Now, with that long bit of history out of the way, let's hop into the voice cast. In the cast for the series, we have Josh Keaton as both Spider-Man and Peter Parker. I like how when he's Spider-Man, the witty one-liners are there. He manages to balance both being the two characters off very well, and I really love that so much about it, because he can balance those characters out, and that is just really great for me that he can do that so seamlessly. And I think honestly, up until Tom Holland did his interpretation, I always felt that when it came to actually the acting of Spider-Man, this was probably the best interpretation. I personally felt that he was superior to the previous person who voiced Spider-Man in the 90s animated show. But I also felt that he was also just as good as Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield when they did their version. I felt they were just as better, honestly, in my opinion. Also, here we have some like reoccurring characters that appear in the show. Gwen Stacy, who honestly, now Gwen Stacy is essentially meant to be Peter Parker's love interest, just like she was in the original comic. She was voiced by Lacey Chabot, and what I like about it is what they've done with her character. I'll be honest, up until the character's famous death in the comics and her being come back as Spider-Gwen, I really felt that she was not really that much of an impact on the said series, on the comics. But here they made her as both an actual character, gave her actual depth and personality. Of course, we do have, the other famous love interest in Spider-Man's life, Mary Jane, portrayed by Vanessa Marshall. Hopefully that name is being pronounced right. Now, what I love about her is she's portraying MJ like she was this strong, competent woman, and not really interesting in being held down. We also have other, essentially well-known characters in the Spider-Man mythos. We have Harry Osborn, portrayed by James Arnold Taylor, really, really great. We also here have J. Jonah Jameson, portrayed by Darren Norris. Honestly, really does the interpretation honestly fun as hell, but also shows that the character is not all mean. He has like decency. We also here have another iconic member of the Spider-Man characters, Flash Thompson, portrayed by Joshua LaBar. Honestly, I like how these characters aren't just black or white. They are given actual depth as the two seasons went on, showing more sides of the character than we already thought. Other characters we have, of course, in characters that we got in the series. Other characters we got included Gwen Stacy's dad, Captain Stacy of the NYPD, Kurt Connors, the future Lizard, his wife, and of course the Black Cat, Liz, and a few notable people that popped up. Most of these guys play a role in the series as mostly in minor roles, like King Kong, a high school student that bullied Peter. We had so many pop up, all fun, and mostly these guys play mostly a role in Peter Parker's life, and that's the thing the show understood. There are two sides to Spider-Man's character: his high school life, and most of these people that you see here play a role in that, whether it's friends, his bullies, his family, which included Aunt May, a fun character, and so much more. But then there's the side of Peter Parker's life that they understand, the villains side, the criminals, the villains. What I like about this is how it did with the villains. Most of these villains, they built up most of these villains, at least the first few, before they did the Sinister Six, which of course which was later formed, but I like how they were introduced. The real main villain for this series was Tombstone, known as either the Big Man, or as he likes to, or as his real identity, L. Thompson Lincoln, arguably the true main antagonist of the series, voiced by Kevin Michael Richardson. And he's essentially kind of this version's Kingpin, because they couldn't use the rights to Kingpin. He was by this point a Daredevil property, even though he was introduced originally as a Spider-Man villain. But I like how he's portrayed here, and he was set to be transformed more closely to the character. I like how he is presented here, really fun. And of course we have his Spider-Man's what is arguably his arch nemesis, the Green Goblin. And interesting, even though, Norman Osborn also appears in the show, but the two characters are voiced by different actors. I'll say that. Not really trying to spoil too much, as no one deserves that. Also, others, we get Electro, a complete redesign compared to his first comic book counterpart, but the character's made so much more in depth, which I really like. The Sandman is also another fun character too. The Sandman is still Flip Marko, a common hood trying to make the big score. But one day, he gets involved in a lab accident because he's originally an associate working for the King, for not the Kingpin, Tombstone, and ends up becoming the Sandman. But rather use his abilities for personal greed, he uses it to finally get the big score. Again, he's not a monster. He's just a hood who realized he has these powers and he wants to use it now to finally, get the big score, essentially, of his career. He has no real quarrels with Spider-Man, unlike his partner, what we get to later. Other villains that are introduced, again, the Black Cat, which is more of a femme fatale type character, which I like. Kraven the Hunter actually got a unique visual redesign. Though, first off here, he looks like his normal version, but then he gets an upgrade version, looks more tiger-like. Again, it's kind of going up against what we know him for, but it's still fun nonetheless. Here we also get Eddie Brock, Venom here, and what I like about the version of Venom in this show is they've completely redone the character to make him more sympathetic. I like how he is written here. And honestly, that was the perfect way to go, because even in the Sam Raimi films and even comics, Eddie Brock was always portrayed as Peter's rival in the photography world and a little bit of a jerk. But once the symbiote gets on him, it unleashes his more negative qualities. Here we also get Mysterio, another sort of B-lister in the Spider-Man Rogues Gallery, and of course we got another A-lister, Dr. Octopus. He's portrayed as this meek scientist, but until an accident unleashes his full potential as a true mastermind villain. And of course, we introduced to a minor Spider-Man villain, Molten Man. Made him far more in depth. He was made to be Liz's brother. He's got out of juvie, and it looked like he was life back on track, but he falls back into his old ways of gambling debts. Next thing you know, he becomes this villain to go up against Spider-Man in order to fully pay off his debt. Other villains we got include the Rhino, another big baddie, and the Lizard, another big bad, and Vulture. More big bads more known to the mainstream comics. But here we have some minor villains, like the Chameleon, who's not really that well known, Hammerhead, not that well known, voiced by Joe DiMaggio, aka Jake, Jake the dog from Adventure Time. For me, every time when I read a Hammerhead in the comics, it's this voice that comes to mind. We also here have the Enforcers, who, and I like how they were done differently. We got Montana, Fancy Dan, and Ox, 3 hired hoods to take down Spider-Man. However, they end up getting superpowers, or gadgets, to become the supervillains. Montana became this version's of the Shocker, a minor league villain. We also here have Ricochet, who was actually a very minor character that was a point I think Spider-Man used as an alias. And then, of course, Ox just went with Ox. Also here, the series went and did introduce very minor villains that not even, I guess, even some hardcore Spider-Man fans may not be familiar with, such as the Tinkerer, who was, of course, redone in the Spider-Man Miles Morales game to be redone, but this is the more classic version. We also here have Miles Warren, the guy that became the Jackal, Silver Sable, completely redone for the show, and Captain Jupiter, J. Jonah Jameson's son, and of course Silvermane, a very well-known member in the Marvel crime mob scene, and he's basically an old man obsessed with immortality, became a cyborg. He's kind of that in the show, but not really. I'll explain more of that when we get further in the review. Also here they gave us Uncle Ben Parker, a very well-known character to the Spider-Man mythos. And I like how they don't show him to us immediately off the bat. It's more weighted. He was voiced by Ed Asner, and that voice is familiar. Well, he played J. Jonah Jameson in the original Spider-Man 90s TV show. So I like how they brought him for this. And again, he's brought really back in the second last episode of season 1 as to really explain Spider-Man's origin, but I like how the origin is weighted, because we kind of know it. And even if you didn't, they waited this long and not doing it immediately off the bat. So they waited to do it, but it ties so well in with the story. And I also like how the season does with its episodes and arcs. And also each season has a theme. And I'm going to get more into that when we actually more into that now actually. When season 1 began, something I noticed, each season had a sort of arcs. The first 3 was to establish essentially Spider-Man, already off the bat, Spider-Man is already well known, kind of, to the supervillain underworld. So far well known that the big man, with his assistant Hammerhead, has hired the enforcers, the three big enforcers, which are called the enforcers: Montana, Fancy Dan, and Ox, to take down Spider-Man. But whilst this is happening, we're getting intertwined with arguably the first supervillain of the series, the Vulture, played by Adrian Toomes. Real name Adrian Toomes, and he is voiced by the guy that gave us, the guy that played Freddy Krueger. So already great on that front. Another thing I also liked is it's also understanding of Spider-Man's social scene. He's trying to, no longer be that dweeb anymore, move up, but part of that still lingers. The first 3 seasons is him really trying to balance both being Spider-Man and Peter Parker. The first 3 episodes with that really arc. Eventually he comes to terms with that. The next 3 is the age of supervillains coming more out of the woodwork, and essentially setting up, the confrontation by the end of that arc, a confrontation between Spider-Man and Tombstone, that even though he knows Tombstone, he's gonna battle him no matter what. I love how they've done with that. And some of my favorite episodes were actually in this season. One of my all-time favorite episodes was, of course, the final, which occurs in the final 4 episodes, which relates to that arc. But in this arc, and then the next arc to follow would be the rival of the Green Goblin and Dr. Octopus, and essentially how they are coming to being, Spider-Man battling them, but also Spider-Man's social scene slightly beginning to change. I will admit, out of all the Season 1 arcs, that's kind of my least favorite, not because of the bad thing, but it's just because I felt like, I don't know, it's just not really that well done, per se, but I absolutely love the twist they gave with the Green Goblin. When you think everyone knows who the Green Goblin is, we were thrown under the rug to find out that the Green Goblin was actually Harry Osborn. Again, as everyone knows, Norman Osborn, in most chronology of any story, becomes the Green Goblin, but we were shocked to find out that's not the case. It was Harry. We also get some references to the comics with Harry, taking these drugs, which was a reference to Harry's drug problems in the comic. The fact they could do that in such a kid's cartoon was so great. I also liked, and then this leads to what is known as the Venom storyline. And this results in, how Peter, and I like how they waited until the end of the season for Peter to finally become, wear the black suit. They didn't immediately start off the bat with him getting that. It started there. Another thing I also appreciated was they waited until the third last episode of the season for the Sinister Six to start to form. And the Sinister Six at that time composed of Dr. Octopus, the Sandman, the Rhino, the Shocker, Electro, and the Vulture, all forming to take down Spider-Man with the help of Hammerhead, and I'm guessing Tombstone having a bit of involvement in their formation to take down Spider-Man. We also see how the symbiote is really affecting Peter Parker's personality, really a bit, and how it kind of manipulates him. Also, another thing I really liked in this season, in that arc, would then lead to, again, this is a 4-parter, and in the third episode of this arc, the symbiote is really taking its toll on him. Really affected his mental state, and also like how he has to be snapped out of it in a few ways. First off, Flash Thompson helps him out, and as we know, Flash Thompson has always been portrayed as Spider-Man's biggest bully. Peter's biggest bully, but loves Spider-Man. It was always an interesting contrast there. But another thing I liked is he's not that heartless, such as in the Green Goblin, that when Doc Ock first appeared, proper, fully formed, Flash wanted to, help out and get everyone to safety, not run away. So it shows that he's not a full bully. Also, it's shown when Peter's going through a hard time with his Aunt May in hospital, he's lashing out at everyone. Peter sets him straight. Everyone's trying to help him, but he's acting like a doofus. And ironically, this begins Spider-Man to think, well, he might be right, especially since he's now considering accepting a job offer to work for Tombstone for cash. Something's off here. But of course, what really helps him break off is the culminating bit where he goes to the church, and he has a sort of fight for his control, his psychological control, and we get to see his origin. with how he got bitten, the wrestling, the death of Uncle Ben, but it's the memory of Uncle Ben that snaps him out of it. That snaps him out of this craziness, which I love to the max. And I like how they waited this long for some of these things to come. The Sinister Six, the symbiote, and Uncle Ben, the origin. They waited until nearly the end of the series. Then culminates in, of course, in the final episode, Venom becomes fully formed. After he finally gets rid of the symbiote, he thinks he's destroyed it. Well, destroys it. But it turns out the symbiote is still alive and latches onto Eddie Brock, who's already suffering from problems. Now, I like how when we first introduced Eddie Brock, he's kind of seen as the closest thing Peter ever had to a older brother, and I guess at one point kind of best friend. It turns out Peter and Brock had a past. Both their parents tragically died in the same plane crash. While Peter was lucky enough to have Aunt May and Uncle Ben take care of him, Eddie was not so fortunate, but he still acted like a good person deep down. How even when Stacy couldn't, have a date to this, I guess, event, he went with her, to cheer her up, showing how good of a deep person he is deep down. But Peter's actions as both Spider-Man and Peter, well, mostly as Peter, began to take the toll on their relationship to the point it completely broke down. Broke down to the point where he hated Peter, and eventually grew to hate Spider-Man when he destroyed the symbiote. Eventually, the symbiote latched onto Eddie and manipulated him, courtesy of all the hatred already built up, and became Spider-Man. And Venom's unique for being a person who's mostly wanting to hurt Peter because he hurt his life, and the symbiote manipulates him. Eventually, of course, he manages to get the symbiote off Eddie, and he feels it, and of course he deals with the symbiote once before, puts it in wet cement, and it looks like the symbiote is gone for good. Once that's happened, we then end the season with him getting a kiss by Stacy, and I like how this was, again, it was clear that Stacy liked Peter, but I like the scene where Venom says, "We're gonna hurt the person you love the most." He thought it was Mary Jane, but when he went after Stacy, he realized it made sense, and this is where he begins to feel maybe he has feelings for Stacy too. Another thing I like about this season is its theme. Actions have consequences, and it applies both in Peter Parker's life and Spider-Man's life, as the two are intertwined. Again, with great power comes great responsibility. So when he's Peter, and there's a supervillain or craziness of crime, he has to stop whatever Peter's doing and go to be Spider-Man, even though that could affect his social standing. And this especially is true with, like when he's really developing a friendship with Liz, and it's clear that Liz is kind of beginning to fall for him. I like how that relationship was done. And as a result of that, Peter's maybe relationship with friends and family kind of looks bad in the process, because he can't tell what's happened. Another thing I also like is in Spider-Man's life too. Actions have consequences. Because Spider-Man is battling all these supervillains, criminals, normal criminals, the criminals realize they need to step up their A game to take down Spider-Man. And this is partly Tombstone, because he realized that when these supervillains are starting to come a bit out of the woodwork, he realized that he can't really interfere with his criminal empire, even though Spider-Man doesn't know he is doing it, and so the supervillains start coming out of the woodwork. Therefore, his actions as crime fighting results in the wave of the supervillains. And even J. Jonah Jameson said this: there was no supervillains until the superheroes showed up. Which is true. I really like that little line. And this all culminates into essentially the final arc that culminates all of that. Peter accepting everything and kind of finding a bit of a balance between the two lives. And I really love that bit so much. And I also admit, another thing I also liked this season was the foreshadowing to stuff to come on the next season, such as character development with the next season, characters not shown being black or white, and also, I admit, the beginning of really Peter and Gwen's kind of relationship beginning to form. Another thing I also liked was it was clear that in the next season Liz and Peter would date. Whether they were endgame was not sure, but it was clearly set up, courtesy of a few episodes, which I really liked. Especially in the Electro episode, where Electro is fully formed, they set up how those two would be, or possibly be. First off, Liz is part of the popular crowd, and doesn't like, and at first hates Peter, but she's forced to be, be next to Peter because the teacher wants her to succeed and has her be like Peter be a personal tutor. Peter is not really into that. When Electro comes, ironically, him leaving saying, you know, once you figure this out, or once you've decided, come and, you know, want to be serious with this, I'll be ready. Essentially, you know, flats out, you know, ignores her, and this makes Liz a bit curious. Next thing you know, the relationship begins to form later in that same episode when they go to Kurt Connor's, I guess, laboratory, and a bit of a spark is forming between there. Even though I don't think neither of the two are really feeling it, but a sort of closeness begins to form. And we get hints of that throughout the season, where Peter's trying out for the football team, Liz says good luck. We also get where they go to the amusement park, where the two are really spending time together. That's fun. And when when Aunt May is in the hospital, Liz is eager to go with Peter to the hospital, but instead, Stacy, Gwen does, and that's fun because it's clear like a bit of it's developing a bit of jealousy there, which I love. Again, I think the season started off really strong and really showed us what we were into. We were going to have arcs, we were going to have character development, and we're also going to get drama from both the Spider-Man side and Peter Parker's side. Again, this is understood that Peter Parker, the two sides of Spider-Man is his kid, is his teen life, and his superhero life. And up until I think the Tom Holland is his portrayal, who finally understood that, I think this one understood it better and did it the best. Next came Season 2. Now, a lot of things came this season I personally found interesting. First off, we got introduced to some new villains. The Mysterio and Kraven the Hunter were introduced. Also, a lot of more references to the comics. Comics this time around, when Dr. Octopus pretended to be reformed, but when he did, a new criminal came called the Master Planner, was planning, essentially becoming a new infamous crime figure within the city's underworld, and it was revealed, of course, that the Master Planner was really Doc Ock. He formed a new version of the Sinister Six, with old faces and new faces. Also like how, also this, and really the first four things is really Peter kind of struggling with how to interact with Gwen now because of that infamous moment, him worrying where Eddie went, the Sinister Six being formed, all that. This all culminates on New Year's Eve, and this results in him, you know, in this infamous moment directly from the comic where he's in Master Planner's lair. Master Planner's making his escape, and even though he's happy that he's won the day, he realizes he hasn't won yet, and this infamous moment where he lifts all this weight, no matter how much pain he's got, lifts it all up, manages to get him, Gwen, and Electro completely out of there before the, place blows up. One of the most infamous moments in comics, adapted very well on this show. And then this full-parter will later end with that infamous moment. It's New Year's now, Liz shows up at Peter's house, and infamous kiss. I was like, we know that we're getting some new drama, but this was just a moment that I kind of saw coming since Season 1. We then enter the new full-parter, which essentially is hinting Venom's return, but also character development with some of our characters. First off, Harry is back after going away to Europe, which was said in a few arcs. He's now back. Liz left Flash because she dated Flash, left Flash for Peter. The two kind of develop a real couple. Harry begins to ask out Stacy, Gwen, and we get Liz's brothers back. And basically, Peter's social hierarchy is changing now. And that's the theme of this season. Change. We see that mostly in Peter's life, changing now. Such as things are changing now. How he's in Peter's life, such as high school standing now, or even bloody, like how he is like in the real world now. Things are changing. And again, the full part is mostly to build up Venom's return. The more of the rivalry between Sandman and the rivalry between Jonah and Spider-Man is really cultivated with the infamous, with Jonah's son becoming Captain Jupiter, which was tied into how it's happening, and the tragic ending, how he's locked up in a mental asylum, is very sad for Jonah, and really understands a bit more of his rivalry and hatred for Spider-Man, a little bit more, though sometimes unjustified. This little bit can kind of make a bit of sense. And this culminates in Venom saying that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, and it looks like Peter's life is about to be turned upside down. Of course, it doesn't end that way, and it ends with the symbiote escaping into the sewers to possibly hinting with the creation of Carnage, and again, Carnage was meant to come in the next season, along with Hydro Man and even Scorpion. They were name dropped this season, and they were clearly meant to come for season 3, but of course, it never happened. And then this ends into my favorite arc. Another great 3-parter arc, essentially the gang war. And that is, again, the change is also affecting in the superhero life. Such as, by this point, we get from a reporter, Foswell, a reporter, and he was shown in season 1, he's come back, and basically he's reporting on this big story, that there's going to be a gang war. It's clear that Tombstone was the #1 big bad, and really controlled all of the crime in the city. However, things are changing. With the new wave of supervillains now coming under the leadership of Dr. Octopus, there's now a new crime lord coming back out of prison. Silvio Manfredi, better known as Silverman, an old-school crime boss. And there's going to be a gang war for control of the city. And I like how it's a change in the criminal system. Such as, Silverman represents old-school organized crime, the gangsters, the structure of how everything ran. Tombstone represents corrupt businessmen that manipulate the laws for their own benefits. And then, of course, Dr. Octopus represents the waves of supervillains. Now, the first two are fun episodes. But we really get into my favorite episode, I guess, of the entire series, Gangland. And it's on Valentine's Day. And it's also involves a little bit of drama in Spider-Man's life, which is basically it's seeing that he's getting a little bit attracted to Gwen, and Liz is a little bit jealous, that whole thing. But really the best bit is when there's this Gangland summit between Tombstone, Silvermane, and Doc Ock, trying to settle their differences and essentially, prevent further gang wars. Already in this arc, it was already said that Tombstone is already, alienating from his right-hand man, Hammerhead. And already Hammerhead was beginning to form, essentially, a double cross to have all the 3 crime lords eliminate themselves, and he becomes the new #1 big man in the city. And what happens is, he sets up by essentially knocking out Vulture and Silver Sable, who in this instance is revealed to be Silvermane's daughter. And essentially the 3 fight. Tombstone puts up one hell of a fight, and Doc Ock naturally uses his robotic arms. But Silvermane reveals he has an ace up his sleeve. He has this sort of robo-suit, which is clearly meant to be an homage to his cyborg look. And the 3 get into an all-out fight. And I absolutely love it. And it's really made the scenes more impactful with the opera. Because this is happening in an opera house, and J. Jonah Jameson happens to be there on a date with his wife. It's fun as hell. And when Peter gets the call of this happening, he has to leave, even though it's Valentine's Day. He doesn't like the idea, but it's his job. So he turns up as Spider-Man and has to battle all 3 of these guys. Gwen Stacy's father, Captain Stacy, also turns up because these 3 are fighting, and he needs to sort it out. And the fight ends in victorious, and the opera score, it just makes it so much more better, especially when it gets underground, and then it's just a final fight between Spider-Man and Tombstone. This is something we've been waiting for. The music score is so perfect. Eventually it ends with all 3 getting defeated, and Tombstone being outed as the big man, and Tombstone, basically his reputation in ruins. Even though he manages to get bailed at the end of the episode, his operations are crippled, and he's under investigation. His days of being the city's #1 crime lord are literally numbered. But this ends with it turns out that everything was manipulated by the Green Goblin to become the city's new crime lord. With him, and like a Green Goblin, he's more in line with the traditional comics. These days, he's more of a criminal mastermind, but back in the early days, he essentially was trying to gain control of the city's criminal underworld. But he was more theatrical. And of course, this ends up with Hammerhead going into hiding with his plan failed. It was clear he was manipulated by the Green Goblin. This then ends in the final 3 episodes of the season. The first bit ends with the Green Goblin creating a new supervillain to take out Spider-Man, rather than distract like all the previous villains usually, like Tombstone always did. But it ends very badly, and this also culminates in the in this famous episode where Spider-Man is sent to prison on request of Norman Osborn, because in this version, Spider-Man is actually sort of friends with Norman, and a really good friendship there, and basically he's there to test out this new prison facility, this new prison cell, and of course he has to try and escape, of course, to see, you know, how good it is. Once he escapes, the Green Goblin has hijacked the system, and basically Spider-Man is trapped in there with every villain that has currently been put away. So the Enforcers, Silvermane, Mysterio, Molten Man, the Rhino, all locked up in here. And this ends with him being victorious, beating everyone in the joint, and whilst this is happening, we're getting cut to the school play that is being done. I like how it's intercut, it's so great, but it also ends, but what makes this episode so great is Spider-Man comes face to face with the Cat Burglar, who's revealed to be Black Cat's father, but it's also revealed that this was the same man that gunned down Uncle Ben. And it's clear that, and I like how the Cat Burglar's given a bit of depth here. He was a criminal, and he said he always used to take pride in the fact he never harmed anyone, but as he got older, he had to take drastic measures, and the one thing he always regretted was killing Uncle Ben that night. That man's life. And so he sacrifices to stay behind and make sure everyone leaves. Even though Spider-Man doesn't forgive him, he understands. But this affects Black Cat and Spider-Man's relationship. She blames Spider-Man for the reason he never leave this place, and he would basically never forgive him. This then ends in the final arc. When Spider-Man finds out that the Green Goblin's back, he's running all of organized crime, he now has to reevaluate the case, especially when Harry comes and says that the reason that he was recently kidnapped by the Green Goblin, and reveals that he thought he was the Green Goblin. Already some questions are being raised. It is then find out that the so-called Green Goblin is neither Harry nor Norman he originally suspected. So this mystery is, who is the Green Goblin? And that's really the main thing to really end this episode. Again, I kind of revealed a little bit about the final episode a bit, but basically, what you really need to know about the final episode is Spider-Man is battling the Green Goblin, and the mystery of who he still is still up in the air. Also, in Peter Parker's life, he's really fully come to terms that he loves Gwen, and Gwen really likes him, and they plan to sort of break off with their respective partners to be together. And again, some things were made, you know, to carry on to the next season. Now, because there was no third season, the storylines that were set up sadly never came to fruition. But however, with rumors of the reboot still up in the air, again, it's coming back now. I personally wish they could give a reboot, at least for season 3, to give it a proper send-off like it should have been. Give it at least a proper send-off. With that, Spectacular Spider-Man for me is such a great show. Great character development, understanding Spider-Man, the Spider-Man character, both of his teen life and crime-fighting life, but also having a unique visual design, heavily inspired by the Stan Lee and Stan Lee era when he was writing Spider-Man. And just like most Spider-Man cartoons, we get a Stan Lee cameo in season 2. Overall, with this, I rate this show 4 out of 5 stars. I guess the reason why I give it 4 was probably because I felt the series never fully, wrapped up. I felt there was so much more to be done. And you think, well, why wouldn't you give it 5? Well, for me, I felt that the full vision of the show wasn't there. So as a result, I personally can't give it that 5th star without that full vision being fully seen. So as a result, I can't, in good conscience, give it that 5th star. But 4 out of 5 is not bad. 4 out of 5 is not bad, and I think that when you get at least somewhere between the 4th or 5th star, it is an amazing accomplishment. And I say that this show is so far the best animated interpretation of Spider-Man out there. And there we have it. That was Spectacular Spider-Man animated series, one of the greatest superhero cartoons, sadly very short-lived, with everything so good about it. A catchy theme song. And that guitar riff to that was so good. Great character development, understanding the characters, making them so fleshed and more dynamic, balancing the humor, action, and drama of any superhero character. This is arguably one of the best interpretations of Spider-Man you'll ever see. Join us next time in Animation Corner when we review Batman the Animated Series, one of the greatest cartoons of all time. Can't wait to review that, my personal thoughts. So until next time, this has been the Stephen Hour in Animation Corner. So until next time, ladies and gentlemen, so long for now.